With the Hemstra, what did you figure out?
Hemstra got the relief. He got the same thing that me and you just discussed. They included a lesser included offense, which was an historical law. And the Supreme Court of Iowa ruled that you can't do this. You can't charge him both ways. So by him exercising all his rights and going to jury trial, because he never pled guilty to it, he was protected by the Constitution to due process. So under due process, they contended that because he was on appeal and went to the Iowa Supreme Court, he was entitled to relief. So he got relief after serving 4 years in state prison. But he got relief based on the way I understood it for a lesser included offense. He didn't get cut loose. So the media came back and said this should apply to everybody that's been convicted of murder, 418 individuals at that time in 2006 that were charged with murder. They should have benefited from this rule of law.
Right.
In which they should have. But because the Iowa Supreme Court didn't make it retroactive, they shut the door on them guys. So if them guys was beyond their post habeas corpus petitions, which would have been a 2254, they couldn't get relief. So what they had to do, like I told you before, is exhaust all those remedies and then take it to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to rule on the question of retroactivity. Had an individual done that, there was a potential that they would apply that retroactive to everybody that was in Iowa's prisons. Because every other state that considered that question said that this law was wrong. So everybody was in agreement with that. So once they ruled in 2006, 2007 on this case, whoever was representatives in Des Moines, Iowa and surrounding communities should have took this back to the legislators so that they could have a vehicle to invoke retroactivity across the board. And everybody that had the circumstances that involved those two charges could have petitioned for relief based upon the question of retroactivity. But individuals weren't doing that. So you come along years later and they're complaining to you about this and about that.
When we talk about the Hemstra,
okay,
being up under that felony murder when willful injury is the predicate to the felony murder, it's unconstitutional, right? Now, I believe he was offered a plea of 10 years, but he fought it, feeling just like you're feeling. No, I shouldn't have to take no plea. I'm innocent. I was protecting myself. I shouldn't get this life sentence. But he got close to 25 years in today for not taking that 10-year plea.
Okay, now Hemstra is a little bit different from some of the cases that you presented to me. Hemstra went to the jury trial, exercised his constitutional rights under the 5th and 6th Amendment, the due process, and the right to a jury determination on the facts of the case. Okay, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to state court. So, exercising his constitutional rights, which gives him the right to appeal and doesn't limit his rights to appeal. His attorney was able to present viable claims that would affect his appeal. Those viable claims was they had charged Hemstra with 2 charges, and the appellate court upheld the lower court's decision based upon my read, and he appealed it to the Iowa Supreme Court. The Iowa Supreme Court overturned the appellate court in the district court's decision based upon the fact they said that he couldn't be charged with a felony murder when he never had the intent to commit murder. So he was able to resolve that issue as far as the felony murder was concerned because he never had what was considered an element of the state charge that was first-degree murder. So when they overturned his case, they took him back to another jury, and he was found guilty of a lesser included offense and ended up serving 4 years in prison for the lesser included offense. But he still was found guilty of a crime. So he didn't resolve the conviction per se. He just got a lesser included offense and didn't have to serve life in prison. Some of the other cases that you brought to my attention is somewhat different than that, because the individual that we just spoke to, he entered into a plea. And I talked about that in one of my views for reformcrimesentencingnow.org about people entering into these contracts that require them to waive all the constitutional rights. Now, if the individual going in, like some of these young men that we just spoke to, don't understand what those constitutional rights are, they don't know how impactful waiving those protections and guarantees are. Well, once you enter into an agreement, that agreement is a contractual agreement that is bound by law, state or federal. So, I mean, you're sitting in jail for a year, 18 months prior to going to trial, or prior to entering into a guilty plea. It's incumbent upon these individuals to start going into them law libraries that are contained within the jail and understanding what the rights are. The brother G-Nut that just demonstrated to me, the first thing he said out of his mouth was his attorney told him. So he took that at face value. He didn't take the necessary approach to find out if his attorney was telling him accurately. Just because you go to school and get a law degree don't mean that you're effective. They're passing so many of these attorneys out of law school. I mean, they're paying upwards of $250,000, $300,000 to get these degrees so they can make the big money.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So, just because somebody tells you something doesn't mean that it's true. And it's incumbent upon you. It's your life.
But at that time, you know, being 18 years old, not knowing nothing about the law, it's like they taking advantage. They taking advantage of the situation
I
that
disagree
he's
with
in.
that. I disagree with that, cuz. I disagree with that for the simple reason. 18 years old, you're considered a young man. You're out there in the street doing whatever it is that you do. You're working a job, you're doing this, you're doing that. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Whatever you're out there doing, you're responsible. Your knowledge is responsible for what you know and what you don't know.
But why would you study law? You got to study law.
You ain't got to
gotta
study
know
law. You ain't got to study law. But you should study what your rights are as an American citizen. You were born and raised here in America. You know, we're dictated by laws. We're dictated by rules and procedures. So why wouldn't you take the time to understand what your rights are as a human being under the eyesight of God? Getting back to the main issue, Mr. Nutt and Hemstra and those guys, is that, you know, you have two different circumstances. Mr. Nutt has a problem with the fact that he entered into a guilty plea. I'm not saying he was wrong for doing that. Any man would be fearful of spending the rest of his life in the penitentiary.
That's right.
But again, if you're faced with 50 years or 75 years or 25 years in prison, there's no guarantee that you're going to get out anyway. Now, you see countless stories on the media that shows that a lot of innocent individuals was locked up based upon lies.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And it took them 25, 30 years
To get out.
to correct that. But those individuals are allowed, after spending and wasting so much time in prison proving their innocence, to file lawsuits. Now, in the case of Mr. Nutt and Mr. Hemstra, Hemstra was still found guilty of a lesser included offense. So he don't get no relief on that. Mr. Nutt entered into a plea of guilty. So even though the court has ruled that his sentence may have been unconstitutional, he can't get no relief for the simple reason he has to go back and get that guilty plea rescinded.
Right.
And so he has to jump through so many hoops to get that done.
Well, he said that the other guy that got the relief did the same thing, enter into a guilty plea and got everything
But he got
reversed.
action, cuz.
He got action because all these guys that got action are white. And I'm feeling like this. Okay, just like with the Hemstra, did you read what happened in the Hemstra case? Where him and another guy was feuding over rental property land, and instead of going to court, or they might have went to court, instead of going to court or going to the police, they went to a middle of the road out in the country where one of the guys ended up with a bullet in his head, dragged to the well by the truck, and then thrown into a well. throwing into a well. Is that not murder or what? Is that not a murder? Or is somebody not plotting something right there? Okay. But he is found with some type of relief to a lesser charge, saying that what we send you to was unconstitutional. So we're going to take back this felony murder, putting willful injury as the felony to the murder, and we're going to give you involuntary manslaughter, 10 years. And they say, you know how they talk, this is just a street talk, he was a farmer that had money, he bought his way out. But I feel like this, he bought everybody's way out, because anybody that is up under that charge where willful injury was the felony to the murder, all that's unconstitutional, and it should automatically be reversed.
Okay.
Like that.
I understand that. I understand what you're saying from the perspective that you're saying it in. But again, being that the United States of America is governed by laws, those laws impede our ability to get relief. So if you don't understand the procedures and the rules that are in place that governs the law and the application of the law, you can't get the relief that Hemster got. Now, Hemster still was found guilty of a lesser included offense. Right. Once the Iowa State Supreme Court overturned his case, he went back for a jury trial. He presented all the facts before the jury. He exercised his constitutional rights. That jury found him guilty of the lesser included offense. And so, after serving 4 years, he was released from prison. But he's still a convicted felon.
But they also, instead of taking everybody with that specific charge, willful injury with a murder, and taking everybody back to court and correcting that, they shut the door on it to where, unless if you caught that certain type of case, now then it will apply to you. But if you caught it beforehand, it doesn't apply to you.
Okay,
now,
and that's a legitimate argument. That's a legitimate argument.
Yes,
that's a legitimate argument. But again, being that the Iowa Supreme Court shut that door, and any individual who would have benefited from that prior to that law going into effect, and then it happened after the fact as far as their sentence is concerned, should have exhausted their state post habeas corpus vehicles. And if the Iowa State Supreme Court didn't rule retroactivity in that case, they should have presented that case in the federal court seeking retroactivity on that question. Now, I don't know.
So they didn't take it further than what it needed to be.
I don't know if anybody in the state of Iowa has ever argued that case to the United States Supreme Court. I don't know about that.
So that's where it got to be taken.
Exactly.
See, when we have an issue, we got to take it to the Supreme Court. You got to take that issue to the max. But I bet you probably some people probably did take it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court passes it back down to the state court.
Not necessarily. What happens is,
what's supposed to happen.
Okay.
But might not happen, because they might say, because I know some guys go to the Supreme Court and they say it's supposed to be handled in the district court.
Right. Okay. They can send it back down. Consistent with the opinion from the Iowa State Supreme Court, or consistent with the opinion of United States Supreme Court as it relates to that issue. But the issue that you just proposed to me was an issue of retroactivity. And that's a critical issue in the process of getting equality and fairness within the criminal court system. You made a valid point about the disparity that manifests in a lot of these cases. But the only person that benefited was Hemster in his case. Didn't know whether you were European, African American, Asian, German, or whatever. It didn't apply to nobody else, unless they were charged after that case went into effect. Now, if a person doesn't understand that this case could apply to them based upon dual charges, which were found to be unconstitutional, then that's on them, and they should have filed ineffective assistance of counsel on the attorney for not raising that point. And I'm sure there's a lot of people sitting in state prison today that was unaware of that. That goes back to the same question that was raised by Mr. Nutt. He say he listened to his attorney, but not once did he say he checked behind his attorney. He just took his attorney at face value. And that's what our people, that's the most critical issue as we speak right now. Stop taking these individuals at face value and do your own homework. If you're out here
Right.
doing this, if you're out here doing that, we got drug dealers out here, we got armed robbers out here, we got murderers out here, and they're going to jail, and they're sitting up in jail. They get spooked by the amount of time they're going to get in prison, and they just take these people's word at face value. How you know this man is telling you the truth? You're not paying him no money. You ain't got no money. That's why you out here committing a crime.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And then you ain't got sense enough. I'm not speaking ill of you. Don't hate on me because I'm saying the truth.
Right.
What I'm saying is you have to be smart enough to be responsible enough to protect your freedoms.
Right.
You protect your freedoms through the exercise of rights. The rights that are accorded you as a United States citizen. Doesn't matter what your nationality is. If you was born and raised here on this particular soil, you have rights.
So in other words, cause we know that there's people that feel like you, but got life sentences and still in prison after 20, 30 plus years, right? But the moral of the story that you're saying is, if you get into a situation where you feel like you're innocent, you need to do your own research.
Yeah, but
As
see,
far as the law,
that's correct.
You're right.
That's correct. But again, you can't do. I mean, some people are fortunate. Most of the individuals that we see in the media, they get out after 25 or 30 years. You get the Innocent Project, and they're showing that these guys were innocent. They were framed. Not only that, being that technology is so advanced today, we're getting to see how law enforcement and the process has arbitrarily applied the law to people who were actually innocent, you know. But when a person is actually innocent, I don't believe no man or woman should enter into a plea agreement that denies them the right to prove their innocence.
Even if there's people telling them, like we're in Iowa, G-Nut situation. He was told, you better take this plea bargain or you're going to get a life sentence, because they're not going to let you off at all, even though that you wasn't in the wrong.
Well, that's
So what does a person do in that situation?
well, that's the stick that state and federal prosecutors utilize when they're trying to prevent a person from exercising rights to a jury trial. One thing that we wrestled with back in the 80s and 90s was that we knew that if 50% of the people that were charged with an offense went to a jury trial, that it would impede, hamper the fair administration of justice and cause them to create better plea agreements and plea bargains for individuals who are willing to enter into those agreements. Because it's difficult, based upon the economical situation of prosecuting a trial, to prosecute by jury everybody that's charged with an offense. But if you're running an assembly line administration of justice, and that's what they did starting back in the 80s, is that they ran people through the criminal court systems on an assembly line. Enter these pleas, enter these pleas. And everybody, in 97% of the individuals that was charged with an offense entered into plea agreements. 97%, whether they were guilty or not guilty.
Right.
They entered into those plea agreements. So the 1% that goes to trial, they suffer the ramifications because their number is minute compared to the number of individuals that are just throwing away their rights and making the government prove their case. And that's what the government and state prosecutors depend on when they charge and prosecute people. And again, I understand the fear factor that comes behind all of that. I understand that. And so I'm not saying a person's right or wrong to take that plunge and sign that contract and go to prison, and you're thinking that they're going to get out in 7 years, thinking they're going to get out in 10 years, because the minimum is you're going to do 10 years in prison anyway.